Kat, are we recording now?
Yes, we're good to
Yes.
go.
Perfect. And so thank you guys for having me for this presentation. I'm very excited to finally get to share what has been the last year of my life, more or less. Um, and that is this paper that was just accepted in Science, although we are under embargo at the moment. And it's a paper about self-organization, specifically a new theory of self-organization that we call rattling theory. And the paper's title is Low-rattling, a predictive principle for self-organization in active collectives. And this was done in collaboration with my good friend Pavel Shvikov at MIT, his advisor Jeremy England, and the groups of Kurt Wiesenfeld and Daniel Goldman at Georgia Tech. What I'd like to start us off with is sort of get a good framing for what it is that we mean when we talk about emergent order. And particularly the example that most clearly comes up is, emergent order in nature rather than artificial systems. And one natural example that you might think of is crystal formation in solidifying liquids or something like that, like, when water turns to ice. This is a process of emergent order and self-organization by which, chaotic particles in a fluid become organized in a lattice-like structure. And this is what we refer to as equilibrium self-organization. Particularly here, there is no energy flowing in and out of the system. It's all a closed system. The math underlying this process tends to be quite a bit simpler, unlike what we see in non-equilibrium processes, such as flocking birds. And here, in the realm of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, really most of life falls under this, or all of life falls under this umbrella, and a lot of non-living things that look like life fall under this umbrella as well. And so what I'd like to focus on is framing what it is that we mean when we say we would like to understand self-organization. And really what I think understanding self-organization, what it's all about is it's all about finding why are certain configurations or arrangements of matter preferred over others. And to help frame that in a bit more of a technical sense, by a configuration, which I'm going to denote throughout this presentation by a vector Q, we really just mean any set of number that sufficiently specifies the arrangement of the system. And for the previous example that I was given of atoms in a lattice, this could just be their positions in the lattice, or for a robot, if you're going to talk about, say, a swarm of robots, maybe it's the position and orientation of all of the rovers in the Euclidean plane. And so I'd like to get started by talking about equilibrium self-organization, the simpler case to work from. And in this setting, there's a lot of conveniences that we're afforded by nature, in that we have conservation of energy that restricts a lot of the allowable transitions that occur within a system. We also have a uniform temperature. That is to say, our system exists in a heat bath that is even at a certain temperature. And we're also given that any one transition that we make from one configuration to another is actually reversible. And so all of these properties taken together, they give rise to what we term equilibrium self-organization. And these properties are encoded in the famous Boltzmann distribution, which you may be aware of. And what the Boltzmann distribution tells you is that self-organization arises via the minimization of free energy. And it doesn't just say that, it gives us an expression through which we can understand that. And it's right here, it's quite simple. P of Q, the likelihood, the probability of a configuration is proportional to the negative exponential of the free energy. Where free energy here is a combination of interaction potentials, so, electromagnetic interactions or gravity, perhaps, and also entropy. And intuitively, for a fixed potential, we've all been taught about the second law, and really what this tells us is that entropy is the enemy of order. And when we have a fixed potential, the Boltzmann distribution tells us in a very precise way how is it that this is actually true. But what changes when we move away from equilibrium? Well, for one, energy conservation no longer holds. Now there's energy flowing through the system in the form of perturbations or external forces, or what we'll be referring to in this presentation as driving. Now, additionally, transitions between configurations may in fact become irreversible. Maybe you were able to make it over an energetic barrier only because there was, by happenstance, an external influx of energy that helped you make it over a kinetic barrier, and now you can't get back. And another thing that happens is that the temperature landscape itself that the system exists in does not have to be uniform any longer. And in a landmark paper in 1975, Rolf Landauer provided what is one of the strongest no-go theorems in thermodynamics, which basically proved that it is, in general, impossible to construct a Boltzmann-like expression that is applicable to all non-equilibrium systems without the help of any of these constraints. And immediately, what the question that pops into my mind is, does this really mean that there's no room for understanding how self-organization arises outside of equilibrium? And for a little bit, I'd like to refocus to a simpler system that is colloidal particles in a fluid, also known as thermophoresis. Thermophoresis, the word itself, is intuitive in the sense that it describes the behavior by which a particle goes from high to low temperature. We're going to be following temperature gradients, just like chemotaxis or phototaxis. Thermophoresis is that same kind of idea. And thermophoresis is, by happenstance, the simplest example of pure non-equilibrium self-organization. So here, none of the principles of equilibrium order that we had before apply. And yet, here, we're going to try to come to an understanding of how it is that self-organization arises. And to illustrate what we're really talking about here, I've borrowed this video from the Zheng research group at UT Austin, where they're taking these microparticles, these colloidal particles dispersed in a fluid, and what they're doing here is they're shooting lasers at the fluid to sort of fluctuate the temperature of the underlying fluid that these particles exist in order to get the system to move from having a Y, the letter Y shape, to a letter T shape. And the system, the properties that dominate thermophoresis, the principle that dominates thermophoresis is that the diffusivity of the system is proportional to the underlying temperature. And so that's precisely what enables one to have fine control over how it is that these particles move when they're in a viscous fluid. And so in each configuration, the system is experiencing thermal fluctuations of different magnitudes that the experimenters are in fact here controlling in order to get them to diffuse in a particular way. And the nice thing about these dynamics is that they're actually analytically tractable. And they admit an expression that is quite similar to the expression that we had in the Boltzmann distribution. But now here, the likelihood of a particular configuration of the colloidal particles in their fluid is actually given by their diffusion coefficient, d of q. And so what does this tell us? Well, apparently, when our non-equilibrium dynamics are given by diffusion, we can actually recover a Boltzmann-like expression that tells us about the long-term behavior of the system, and it allows us to understand why certain configurations of this thermophoretic system persist for long time. But how does this really help us concretely? Can we extrapolate from this simple, very simple, idealized active matter system to other systems of interest, such as, I don't know, perhaps a swarm of robots, or maybe living systems? And this is what sets up the need for rattling theory to step in. And what rattling theory is, rattling theory underpins the emergence of non-equilibrium self-organization in what are referred to as sufficiently complex dynamical systems. And what I mostly mean by that is that there are no long-range correlations between the configurations that the system takes on. In reality, this is a much more involved definition beyond the scope of the talk, but this is mostly what we mean by it. In reality, what we mean is that the system is very messy, that there's a lot of apparent disorder in the system. And rattling theory itself arises from the suggestion that the dynamics of such a sufficiently complex dynamical system are well captured by diffusion in their configuration space. So if we have some configuration vector that describes all of the arrangements of a set of robots in a swarm at time t, then we would expect that the square of the displacement that occurs in configuration space over a time interval dt scales according to the diffusivity of the system. And so why are we doing this? Really, the intuitive hope is that when our dynamics are diffusive, the results that we had holding in thermophoresis apply here as well. There we were able to recover a simple expression for the Boltzmann distribution, or for a Boltzmann-like distribution that describes the long-term behavior of the system, and really here we're hoping to do the same. However, before we can actually assess just how reasonable or unreasonable this hope is, we actually need to have some quantity that allows us to estimate the degree of diffusion in some complicated dynamical system. And that's precisely what we name rattling. Rattling is really nothing more than an estimator of the diffusion coefficient of some dynamical system from the configuration space trajectories. And here specifically, it's the log determinant of some configuration dependent matrix C, where in fact, what the configuration dependent matrix C is just the covariance of our configuration space velocities as initialized from a given condition, initial condition Q. And while this choice of quantity may seem a little ad hoc, it actually makes a lot more sense when we realize that for pure diffusion processes, the covariance matrix and the diffusion tensor that describes the evolution of the system have the following relationship right here. And so really, with rattling, the quantity itself, we can now put a number to the degree of diffusivity that we can observe from the system starting from a given configuration. And that allows us to state our main result. And that is the low-rattling selection principle, which states that the likelihood of a configuration is given by its rattling value. However, unlike in thermophoresis, our diffusivity is not actually the result of temperature fluctuations and interactions with some random numbers drawn from a temperature landscape. Here, instead, the rattling landscape is a result of how the system's configurations respond to this external forcing. And so in reality, it's actually quite a rich quantity for interpretation. And so what the low rattling selection principle really says is that for all non-equilibrium dynamical systems that satisfy our assumptions of messiness and sufficient complexity, which again, I'll refer you to the paper when it does come out for the details on what all that entails, then we can actually come to understand how it is that some configurations of a system are preferred over others, even outside of equilibrium. And now I'd like to move past sort of covering the basics of the theory and really start to dig into some of the experimental evidence for how it is that this might arise. And for starters, we are going to think about diffusion in some landscape. And right here, here's an example of some diffusivity landscape up above in the colorful rainbow palette, where we have some particle that diffuses according to the temperature that is assigned by the color. And in line with our theory, what we find is that we can predict the steady state likelihood of any given configuration for this system by measuring its rattling value. And as noted by the linear relationship between the log steady state probability and rattling R, where you'll note that I've quickly used logarithmic axes to make this a linear relationship. And well, this same relationship we find holds in random Markov graphs, swarms of simulated robots, and real experimental robots. And so now I'd like to step in and look at one of these systems in a bit more detail. And specifically, I'd like us to talk about smarticles. Smarticles are 3 linked robots that are very simple and interact with one another via collisions. They slap each other around. Sometimes they pull each other. And the configuration of a smarticle, as you can see here on the right, is given by its position and orientation in the Euclidean plane. And what we refer to as the drive or the external source of energy, the external forcing pattern, is the arm movement, the schedule of arm movements, alpha 1 and alpha 2 over time. And while a single smarticle is unable to locomote, a swarm of them can actually exhibit surprisingly complex dynamics, as you can see here in this fun video, where it is very difficult to truly predict what it is that the smarticles are going to be doing long-term without some additional knowledge. However, when we look at the smarticles through the lens of rattling theory, we actually find that the smarticle configurations themselves, their likelihood is actually given by the rattling measure as predicted. But, you know, outside of looking at these cryptic plots, what does this actually look like intuitive? What is a low rattling configuration versus a high rattling configuration? What do these things look like? And so hopefully this video helps with this. So here we're starting from 5 nearby initial conditions that are all low rattling, and we're overlaying them all on top of each other. As you can see, the swarm itself maintains its relative cohesion and coherence. And now here we're going to look at 5 high rattling initial conditions. And we're going to find very quickly that they diverge. So they fill up much more space over time. In line with explaining how it is that some configurations of the smarticle swarm are selected, or why they're more prevalent versus others, I've got this plot over here that I find quite striking. Despite representing only 0.1% of all possible configurations by volume, the low rattling clusters in blue, they actually make up 99% of the probability mass experimentally and in simulation that we observe. So over here on the plot to the right, the red cloud represents the space of all possible smarticle configurations, and blue, those are all the points that correspond to the low rattling clusters. And so what do the movements, what are these low rattling clusters actually look like? What do they actually look like in experiment? And hopefully now this video can help illustrate that. So this is one such low rattling state where we're using the drive shown in the top left corner. And here we're just comparing between simulation and experiment to show qualitative agreement. But as we noted in the previous plot, there's many such low rattling clusters. So this really indicates that our system is actually able to have different orderly behaviors, as we can see here. And these behaviors are in fact very stable over time, to the point where in a given experiment, they may be stable for over the course of hours. And so at this point, you may be wondering, in what sense does this resemble diffusion? This does not look like diffusion as I am used to. And that's part of the magic of talking about configuration space diffusion. It doesn't necessarily directly map onto our more Euclidean understanding of the world inherently. But nonetheless, because the low rattling selection principle holds, our assumption that our dynamics are well approximated by configuration space diffusion seems to hold as well. But I'd also like to illustrate just another sense in which this is true. And so here I have one such low rattling attractor of the system, and without us doing absolutely anything, spontaneously, the system will diffuse into another low rattling cluster, where it will now persist and evolve until it diffuses right out of it again. And so hopefully this helps illustrate that, as unintuitive as it may seem, this swarm of robots is in fact exhibiting configuration space diffusion in a way that we are not controlling for. So this is great and all. I've now described to you in what sense rattling theory describes the rise of self-organization far from equilibrium, but now I'd like to illustrate what new things we can say using rattling theory. And so as we've already covered, the steady state is full of distinct low rattling attractors that we diffuse between. But as we noted before, the rattling landscape is actually emergent from the interactions of the internal system dynamics and how they couple to the external forcing patterns. And so each steady state distribution we would expect to be different for each drive. And in fact, this is true. So here I'm showing you two different drives, drive A and drive B, up in the top segment of the figure. And below, I'm showing you their configuration space clusters that they form. And although similar, as noted by the fuchsia circles, some clusters are overlap. There are quite a few that don't overlap. And so if every single time that we pump energy into our system with a different pattern, a different outcome is gonna arise, does this mean that we don't really have the ability to generalize our predictions? Well, I would like to show you one sense in which we could generalize these predictions. And so now let's take a closer look at these drive patterns A and B. This is what they look like. They're quite similar. And this is what it looks like when they're in the smarticle ring. So what I'd like to do next is construct a mixed drive pattern by randomly switching between drives A and B according to a Poisson process. And what this looks like is the following. It's a little difficult to because the drives are so similar, it's a little difficult to pick up on what they're doing. But this is how it evolves. So when we construct our drive in this way, what can we additionally say? Well, rattling theory actually allows us to make predictions about combinations of drives when we don't have temporal correlations between them. And in fact, these predictions can be made rigorous through the following relationship. And so what does this tell us? Well, you may be recognizing this kind of pattern from somewhere else in your engineering education. And what this tells us is that non-equilibrium steady states add up like resistors in parallel. And so what you'll note here on the right side now, I am now showing you the drive A plus B, where we stochastically switch between drive A and drive B. And right below, I'm showing you the clusters that remain once we've combined the drives. And I'll switch to the previous plot just so you can note that the only clusters that actually remain under the combined drive are the ones in the fuchsia circles, which are the ones that overlap. So what does this tell us? Only configurations that are stable under both drive patterns will be able to persist. And this is codified, of course, in the correlation that we verified empirically over in D, where we have a linear relationship between the individual steady states and their combined steady states, according to the inverse addition law. So that's great. Now I'd like to circle back to one of the sort of key intuitive concepts when talking about self-organization, and that is entropy. So we found at equilibrium that entropy played a very simple but key role in determining whether or not our system was going to be able to self-organize or not. And in the context of rattling theory, our intuition about entropy still holds. Entropy does actually pose barriers to self-organization, but its relationship to the steady state likelihood, rather than being so direct in that, more entropy, less likely, more entropy, more likely, here, this relationship will now be mediated by rattling. And I'd like to start by looking at this from an empirical point of view. And really the key concept here is that entropy interacts with rattling by raising the rattling of the lowest rattling configurations in our landscape. And so looking at our rattling and steady state likelihood correlation, here I have the linear correlation that we're familiar with, where I have some simulated and some experimental data, and I'm specifically tracking two configurations using the purple crosses. Here, we're evolving the system under drive A, which I showed you in the previous video, but it's not so important. And it works exactly as it was shown before. But what I would like to do now is introduce a 20% probability of introducing a random arm movement. So instead of just proceeding with the smarticle drive pattern in the way that it would normally do it, there is a 20% chance that we pick a random arm movement out of nowhere. And this is effectively equivalent to raising the entropy of the drive pattern. So an external entropy injection. And so what do we observe? Well, the linear correlation between rattling and steady state likelihood still persists. It's still clearly there. However, it's truncated now. We no longer have access to the lowest rattling values. Well, so what happens when we do this one more time? Well, as you can see, this becomes even more dramatic. So this helps us understand how it is that entropy and rattling interact, and how it is that rattling and entropy mediate the ability for a system to self-organize. And this prediction is actually not just empirically true, but it's analytically true as well. The black line shown here in this plot as a function of drive randomness actually provides us with an upper bound on the likelihood of a system configuration as we increase external drive entropy. Interestingly, the way in which external entropy injection and internal entropy generation from the system, how those two different concepts plug into rattling, is actually identical from the perspective of rattling. And rather than show you these same results for the internal entropy generation, I thought that I could show you here a video of what happens when we lower friction in order to increase internal entropy generation. And so this is the same experiment with 3 smarticles doing the same gate, the same drive pattern in a ring. And as you can see, we're not really seeing the same self-organization patterns. The system is just sort of bouncing around and everything's a lot more unstable. And so those low rattling clusters that we had before have sort of melted away and given away to entropy. And so I'd like to conclude by sort of wrapping up what it is that the low rattling selection principle gives us. And it gives us a general way of understanding the emergence of order for this class of systems, which we term sufficiently complex or messy non-equilibrium dynamical systems. And the intuition here is that while in equilibrium, spontaneous order arises when we have a reduction in free energy that is large enough. Away from equilibrium, self-organization arises when a large reduction in rattling is available. And this points towards future applications in control of active matter and microrobotic swarms, where instead of solving a very complicated and intractable control problem, instead what we do is we design open loop schedules of external forcing, and we observe the self-organization that arises with each drive, and using the inverse addition law of the non-equilibrium steady states, we can actually combine them and get responses that we're interested in. And finally, to sort of just, now that we have rattling theory as a way of seeing the world, when we take a lens to the field of active matter, which is already thriving and existing, we just see that there are already so many applications and phenomenology that indicate low rattling phenomena that could themselves lead to very interesting applications. Here's a video of an active matter system from Petya Blachowska's lab here at Northwestern, where they have these rotating clusters that clearly we can take that energy from their rotation and turn them into potentially useful work at the micro and nano scales. And I hope that this work can sort of push us in that direction. Now I'd like to conclude by acknowledging, of course, all the great people that I got to work with during this project. Of course, Todd, Kurt, Dan, and Jeremy, as well as Alex, Akash, Will, and Pavel. And yeah, now I'm happy to take any questions.